This does feel in many ways, and Josh, you alluded to this, like what we saw in the early days of the pandemic, right? The imposition of travel restrictions and the onus on, in this instance, right, the onus is on airlines to get this stuff implemented.
Dale Jackson here for Yellow Hammer. Now, it looks like we are dealing with travel restrictions again, but our friends in the media and their Democrats seem to be leaving something out of the conversation that we used to talk about when Donald Trump was talking about travel restrictions. It's kind of odd. See if you can pick it up.
At 12:01 a.m., they will begin requiring a negative COVID test pre-departure from anyone coming from China. It doesn't matter if you're Chinese, American, or anything else. If you're coming by plane from China to the United States, you're going to have to get a negative COVID test up to 2 days before departure. It can be a PCR test. It can also, interestingly, be one of those antigen self-tests that you take if it's the kind that you do via telehealth, which means essentially somebody is on a webcam watching you take that COVID test, and you kind of hold up the results so that they can see that it's a negative test. And that way you can get a piece of paper that says, look, this person actually did have a negative COVID result. The U.S. also says that in response to these concerns in China, they are stepping up their tracking and surveillance of travelers who are coming into the country by adding 2 new airports in Los Angeles and Seattle to that monitoring program as they try to get a handle on this. And they acknowledge fully, U.S. health officials, that this is not going to prevent every single COVID case from entering the country from China. But they say it will go a long ways towards trying to slow the spread. And they also reiterate that the U.S. continues to make offers to China to help it with its COVID crisis, including an offer of vaccines. But they say so far China has not been willing to take the U.S. up on that offer, although they say that offer still stands despite these new restrictions going into place on January 5th, Hallie.
This does feel in many ways, and Josh, you alluded to this, like what we saw in the early days of the pandemic, right? The imposition of travel restrictions and the onus on, in this instance, right, the onus is on airlines to get this stuff implemented.
That's exactly right. The airlines are going to be the ones who are going to take a look at your negative COVID test and decide, whether or not it meets the criteria, whether to let you onto that flight. That is the key reason that health officials are not putting in this policy into place right now. You might say, all right, well, if we're concerned right now, shouldn't we do this immediately? Might it be too late if we wait until January 5th? But just like we saw when the U.S. imposed travel restrictions at the very beginning of the pandemic, this creates chaos for airlines at a time when, as we have been covering, there's plenty of chaos already in the airline industry. And so public health officials say that they will start this on January 5th so that they can work with the airlines to help them understand what is going to be required and help prepare them to be the ones who actually do that verification of these negative COVID tests.
Josh Letterman live for us there on the White House North Lawn. Josh, thank you for that reporting. Dr. Gupta, let me go to you here. Is this the right call by the administration?
Ellie, absolutely. This is proactive. And as Josh has already really concisely said, this is meant to slow transmission, not eliminate it. We are dealing with variants here in the United States, XBB being the newest incarnation. So this is not about eliminating new variants of concern, but it's about having surveillance. It's about knowing what we're dealing with here so that we could potentially buy time to understand if a variant of concern is originating out of the Chinese mainland or Hong Kong, that we would be able to see whether or not that variant was susceptible to the vaccines and treatments that we have. So this is about building in intelligence surveillance where it does not exist, because the Chinese are not sharing the variant data, the genomic data that Josh mentioned, to the global database. And as a result, we just don't know what we don't know.
How long would you anticipate that these restrictions may last? Can we even say at this point, Dr. Gupta?
I think it's hard to speculate. I would imagine at least through cold and flu season, or until the current surge in China starts to level off. We expect that that's probably going to be at least until February from a case standpoint. We know their hospitals are getting overwhelmed. So that's going to be key. I will also just emphasize here, this is not a travel ban. This is just an implementation of policies I'm sure many of your viewers have already had to incur when they travel other parts of the world. 48 hours before you test and get back into the United States, you have to show proof of a negative rapid antigen test that we all have at home, or a more specialized test, a nucleic acid amplification test, NAT for short. This is not unusual. This is not new. This is proactive, and it gives us some surveillance where we lack it right now.
The term that is missing here, obviously, is xenophobia. Yes, this is what the American media and the now Biden administration, meaning the Biden campaign at the time, was all about tossing around. Why? Because Donald Trump was doing it, and you had to call him racist, and you had to call him names, and you had to pretend that what he was doing was awful. It wasn't that we were in a bad situation and things needed to be taken care of. It was that he was a bad guy doing bad things. But once again, the Biden administration finds itself in a pretty familiar situation. Run down the previous administration, get into office based on running down the previous administration as evil and awful and almost amoral, terrible, realize that your ideas are bad and don't work, and then come back and try to re-implement the ideas of the previous administration. You're seeing it here. That's what's happening. There's no question. We see it. Whether or not it's effective or necessary, that's an entire other issue. What it's not is xenophobic. There's the Title 42 situation at the American border. They came in and completely tried to undo the Trump administration's immigration policies, and we've seen a complete disaster since that started, and now they're trying to unscrew up that situation to be politically correct and nice. And you also see it with the economy. They've created a lot of problems there as well, and eventually they will have to come back before their next election and realize that all this talk of raising taxes and all this crazy nonsense they're doing is not helping, and maybe cut back on the spending as well. The point, though, is very simple. It's all about saying you're not Donald Trump. Well, congratulations. That got you elected, and it helped them in the midterms by saying they weren't Donald Trump. But eventually, they will have to stand on their own 2 feet. And when they try to do so, they will find that their legs are rather wobbly.